The twin moons of the alien world cast an eerie glow over the endless desert. Ethan Kane adjusted the scarf around his face, shielding himself from the biting winds, carrying sand that stung like needles. He hated this planet. Too hot during the day, freezing at night, and completely unforgiving. But orders were orders, and as a soldier, he followed them without question. The sandstorm was picking up, making it harder to see. Ethan's scanner beeped faintly, signaling something ahead. He squinted through the swirling sand and spotted a faint shape, small, humanoid, and slumped against a rock. "Great," he muttered. "Another scavenger left for dead." Still, he couldn't just walk away. Ethan approached cautiously, his hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder. As he got closer, he realized the figure wasn't human. It was an alien, a woman from a species he didn't recognize. Her skin shimmered faintly, a silvery blue that seemed to catch the moonlight. She was injured, her leg twisted unnaturally, and her breathing was shallow. "Hey," Ethan called out, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" The alien woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep violet irises. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, the words incoherent. Ethan frowned. She wouldn't last long in this storm. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered, pulling a thermal blanket from his pack and wrapping it around her. Her body trembled, and she clutched the edges of the blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Ethan activated his comms, but the storm's interference made it useless. "Figures," he grumbled. He had no choice but to carry her back to his temporary outpost, a small, camouflaged shelter barely big enough for one person. "This is going to hurt," he warned, carefully lifting her. She gasped in pain but didn't resist. Ethan adjusted his grip and began the slow trek back, the storm howling around them. By the time they reached the outpost, the temperature had dropped significantly. Ethan set her down on the cot, her body shivering uncontrollably. He sealed the door and activated the heater, though it would take time to warm the tiny space. The alien woman tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the cot. "Rest," Ethan said firmly. "You're safe now." Her violet eyes locked onto his, a mix of fear and gratitude shining through. "Cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan grabbed another blanket and tucked it around her. "That's all I've got. Just hang in there." She shivered again, her silvery blue skin looking pale. Ethan frowned, realizing that even with the heater, she might not survive the night in her condition. Something about her vulnerability tugged at him, making him feel responsible for her well-being. As the storm raged outside, Ethan sat beside her, wondering how he'd ended up in this situation. A soldier trained for war, now a caretaker for an alien stranger. "This planet just keeps getting stranger," he muttered, shaking his head. Ethan leaned against the wall of the tiny outpost, his arms crossed as he watched the alien woman shiver under the blankets. The heater buzzed faintly, struggling to keep the room warm against the freezing desert night. Despite the layers of thermal fabric, she seemed no better. Her skin's faint silvery glow had dimmed, and her breathing was shallow. He crouched beside her, concern tugging at his usually stoic demeanor. "You're still freezing," he said, more to himself than to her. "This heater isn't cutting it." Her violet eyes opened slightly, dull and tired. "Too cold," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, frustration building. He patched up wounded soldiers, even tended to civilians caught in crossfire. But this was different. Her biology was a mystery to him. What worked for humans might not work for her. "You need more warmth," Ethan said, glancing around the cramped space. There wasn't much else he could offer. He picked up the extra blanket from the supply crate and gently draped it over her. "That should help." But she shook her head weakly. "No, not enough." Her voice was faint but insistent. She looked at him with pleading eyes. "Share. Warmth." Ethan froze. "What?" "Body warmth," she murmured. "My species needs contact to survive extreme cold." He stared at her, unsure if he'd heard her right. "You're saying, I need to stay close to you." She nodded slightly, her glowing skin flickering like a fading ember. "Please." Ethan stood and paced the small room, running his hands through his short-cropped hair. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He was a soldier, not a nursemaid. But the desperation in her voice was hard to ignore. She was clearly at her limit, and without help, she might not make it through the night. "All right," he said finally, his voice gruff. "But this is just to keep you alive. Don't get any ideas." She gave a faint smile, though her exhaustion made it barely visible. Ethan sighed, sitting down beside her on the narrow cot. Her body trembled as he hesitated, then finally pulled the blankets over them both. He lay down stiffly, his back against the cold wall. Almost immediately, she shifted closer, her glowing hands lightly touching his arm. Her skin was icy to the touch, but within moments, he felt her begin to warm. Her glow brightened, faint but steady now. "You humans," she murmured softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "So kind." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Don't get used to it." The storm outside roared louder, but inside the tiny shelter, the tension began to ease. As her breathing steadied and her trembling stopped, Ethan realized this strange alien woman wasn't just a problem to solve. She was someone who needed him. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was doing more than following orders. He was saving a life. Ethan woke with a start, the faint glow from the alien woman's skin casting a soft light in the dim shelter. For a moment, he didn't move, unsure of where he was. Then the events of the previous night rushed back to him. The storm, the freezing cold, and her desperate plea for warmth. Zira, as she had introduced herself during a brief moment of clarity, lay next to him, her breathing steady now. Her silvery blue skin shimmered faintly, no longer pale and lifeless. She wasn't trembling anymore, a sign that the warmth had worked. Ethan exhaled in relief. He carefully shifted to sit up, not wanting to disturb her. As he moved, Zira stirred, her violet eyes fluttering open. She looked at him with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. "You stayed," she said softly. Ethan shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, couldn't let you freeze to death. That'd be bad for my conscience." Zira smiled faintly, though her voice was still weak. "Your warmth saved me. Thank you." "Don't mention it," Ethan replied, standing up to check the heater. It was still running, but the fuel reserves were getting low. He frowned. "We'll need to figure something out soon. This heater won't last much longer." Zira sat up slowly, wincing as she adjusted her injured leg. Ethan noticed and crouched beside her. "Let me see that," he said, carefully inspecting the twisted limb. Her skin felt warmer now, but the injury was severe. "I'll need to make a splint," Ethan said, grabbing his toolkit. "Your leg won't heal right without it." Zira watched him work, her gaze filled with quiet admiration. "You are different from what I was told about humans." Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "My people," she explained, "speak of humans as warriors, ruthless, only taking what they need." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Well, they're not completely wrong. We're fighters, sure, but we're not heartless. Most of us, anyway." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're kind, brave. Why help someone like me?" Ethan paused, his hand still as he finished tying the splint. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "Doesn't matter if you're human or alien. You needed help." Zira's glow brightened slightly, a sign of her gratitude. "Perhaps we are not so different." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, maybe. Let's just focus on getting you back on your feet first." He finished securing her leg and sat back, wiping his hands. The storm outside had quieted, but the cold was still biting. They would need to find a way to get Zira to safety soon, especially if the shelter supplies ran out. Zira looked at him, her violet eyes steady. You saved my life, Ethan Kane. I will not forget this. Ethan gave her a small smile. Just doing my job. Now let's figure out how to get off this frozen rock. The storm had passed, leaving behind a frozen silence. Ethan stood outside the shelter, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. The desert landscape looked alien and harsh, shimmering under the twin suns that had returned. The temperature had risen slightly, but the cold still bit through his jacket. Behind him, Zira hobbled out of the shelter, leaning on the makeshift crutch Ethan had fashioned for her. Her silvery blue skin glowed faintly in the daylight, though her steps were slow and careful. You shouldn't be out here, Ethan said, lowering the binoculars. You need to rest. Zira shook her head, her violet eyes determined. I cannot stay hidden forever. My ship, it must be nearby. Ethan sighed. I get that, but you're still recovering. If you push too hard, you'll make things worse. Zira's gaze softened. You have already done so much for me, Ethan Kane. But I cannot risk staying in one place for too long. My people will come looking for me. And others might too. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Others? You mean enemies? She hesitated before nodding. There are those who would exploit my capture. My ship carries important data. If they find it before we do, it will put many lives at risk. Ethan rubbed his temples, realizing how much more complicated things had just become. So, you're saying we have to find your ship before anyone else does? Yes, Zira said firmly. But I cannot do it alone. Ethan glanced at her injured leg, then back at the horizon. All right, he said with a resigned sigh. Let's see what we're dealing with. Using his portable scanner, Ethan swept the area for any signs of metallic debris. The device beeped faintly, pointing southeast. Zira's face brightened slightly. That direction, she said, her voice filled with hope. I remember fleeing from there. Ethan nodded. Then that's where we'll go. But you'll need to pace yourself. It's a long walk. Zira gave a small smile. I will try. They began their trek across the frozen desert, the silence between them broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. Ethan kept a steady pace, glancing back every so often to make sure Zira could keep up. She moved with surprising determination, despite her injury. After hours of walking, they came across the first sign of wreckage. A jagged piece of alien metal half buried in the snow. Zira knelt beside it, her glowing hands brushing the surface. This is from my ship, she said softly. We are close. Ethan scanned the area, his device beeping more frequently now. Let's hope it's still in one piece. As they pressed on, a faint shadow appeared on the horizon. Zira's glow brightened. There it is, she said, pointing. Ethan squinted, spotting the outline of a damaged vessel embedded in a snowy ridge. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. A low, distant rumble echoed through the air, sending a chill down his spine. Something's coming, Ethan muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. The rumble grew louder, echoing across the frozen desert. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle as he scanned the horizon. The damaged ship was barely 100 meters away, but something was approaching from the opposite direction. Zira stumbled slightly, leaning on her crutch. What is that sound? She asked, her voice tense. Ethan shook his head. I don't know, but it doesn't sound friendly. A shadow appeared on the ridge, and moments later, a large reptilian creature emerged. Its scaled body shimmered with icy frost, and its long, clawed limbs dug into the snow as it moved. It was at least twice Ethan's height, with eyes that glowed an ominous red. Zira's glow dimmed as she stepped back. A frost beast, she whispered, fear evident in her voice. It must have been drawn by the wreckage. They hunt anything warm-blooded. Ethan cursed under his breath. Great, just what we needed. The beast let out a guttural roar, its breath misting in the freezing air. It charged toward them, its claws tearing through the snow like knives. Ethan raised his rifle and fired a warning shot, the sound cracking through the air. The beast hesitated for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing. Run, Ethan shouted, grabbing Zira's arm. She stumbled but followed, her injured leg slowing her down. The ship was their only chance of safety. They sprinted toward the wreckage, the frost beast roaring behind them. Ethan turned and fired another shot, aiming for its legs. The bullet grazed its scales, but the creature barely flinched. It was fast, too fast. "We're not going to make it," Zira cried, her voice shaking. "Yes, we will," Ethan growled, pulling her forward. "Just keep moving." The wrecked ship loomed closer, its twisted metal structure rising like a beacon. Ethan spotted an opening in the hull, just big enough for them to squeeze through. "There," he shouted, pointing. Zira stumbled as they reached the ship, but Ethan caught her, practically lifting her through the gap. He scrambled in after her just as the frost beast slammed into the side of the ship, the impact shaking the ground. The creature roared in frustration, its claws scraping against the metal. Inside the ship, the air was slightly warmer, though the dim interior was littered with debris. Zira clutched her side, breathing heavily. "It will not stop," she said, her voice trembling. "It can sense our heat." Ethan glanced around, his mind racing. "There has to be something in here we can use to scare it off." Zira pointed to a flickering console. "The emergency power core. If we overload it, the energy burst could drive it away." Ethan nodded. "Show me how." Together, they scrambled to the console, Zira guiding him through the alien controls. The frost beast continued to hammer at the ship, its roars echoing through the walls. Ethan worked quickly, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar buttons. "Almost there," Zira whispered, her glow returning faintly. "Just a little longer." Ethan's hands moved quickly over the console, guided by Zira's instructions. The alien symbols made no sense to him, but her calm, steady voice kept him focused. Outside, the frost beast roared, slamming its massive body against the ship. The walls shuddered with each impact, and a low groan echoed through the structure. "This thing isn't going to hold forever," Ethan muttered. "How much longer?" Zira leaned against the console, her glowing fingers tapping on a small panel. "The power core is old," she said, her voice strained. "It takes time to build an overload. But we are close." Ethan cursed under his breath. The beast's claws scraped against the hull again, its frustration evident. He glanced at Zira, noticing how pale her glow had become. "You doing okay?" "I will be fine," she said, though her voice wavered. "We must focus." Ethan nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. He glanced at the jagged opening they had entered through, the only barrier between them and the monster. "If this doesn't work, we're out of options." Zira met his eyes, her expression both determined and apologetic. "It will work." The beast roared again, this time forcing its massive head through the gap in the hull. Ethan raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the creature's snout, and it recoiled with a deafening screech. But the temporary retreat only fueled its anger. "It's buying us time," Ethan said, though his voice was tight with worry. Zira tapped the console one last time, and a series of beeping sounds filled the air. "The overload sequence is ready," she said, "but we must activate it manually." Ethan frowned. "Manually? That sounds risky." "It is," Zira admitted, "but there is no other way." Ethan exhaled sharply, looking between the console and the growling beast. "All right, tell me what to do." Zira hesitated, her glowing eyes softening. "You have done so much already. I cannot ask this of you." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "You're not asking. I'm deciding. Now tell me what to hit." Zira pointed to a lever near the core, encased in a glowing compartment. "Pull that lever. It will release the energy surge." Ethan moved toward the lever as the frost beast slammed against the hull again, forcing its claws through the gap. The ship groaned, metal screeching under the strain. Zira's voice rang out behind him. "Once you pull it, the energy will force it away. But we must get clear immediately." "Got it," Ethan said, gripping the lever. Here goes nothing. With a deep breath, he pulled the lever. The core lit up, glowing brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in a blinding light. The beast let out a pained roar, its body jerking violently as the energy burst hit it. "Go!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Zira's arm. They stumbled toward the far side of the ship as the core surged, shaking the structure. Behind them, the beast howled, retreating into the blizzard. The blinding light from the power core pulsed one final time, filling the ship with a deafening hum. Ethan dragged Zira through the narrow corridor, the walls trembling as the energy burst reached its peak. Behind them, the frost beast let out a guttural roar, retreating into the icy wilderness. Ethan leaned against the wall, panting as the vibrations subsided. The ship groaned under the strain, but it held steady. Zira clutched his arm, her glowing eyes wide with relief. "It's leaving," she whispered. He nodded, glancing back toward the core chamber. The bright light had faded, leaving the room eerily quiet. "Yeah, but we might have cooked the core for good. That was one heck of a blast." Zira winced, limping slightly as she adjusted her weight on her crutch. "The ship is damaged, but the core's surge bought us time. The frost beast will not return soon." Ethan exhaled heavily. Good. That thing was way too close for comfort. They moved cautiously through the ship, searching for anything salvageable. Most of the systems were fried, the overload having knocked out what little functionality remained. Ethan picked through the debris, his sharp eyes scanning for tools or supplies. Zira stopped at a console near the ship's navigation chamber. Her glowing hands hovered over the controls, and to Ethan's surprise, a faint hum responded. "This part of the system still works," she said, her voice hopeful. "What is it?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "The communication array," Zira replied. "It is weak, but it may still send a signal." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think you can call for help?" She nodded, though her expression was uncertain. "If the array holds long enough, I can send a distress beacon. My people will come." Ethan crossed his arms. "And how long will that take?" "Hours, maybe a day," Zira admitted. "But it is our best chance." Ethan frowned, glancing toward the opening where the frost beast had attacked. The cold wind still howled outside, and he didn't trust the creature to stay gone for long. "Then let's move fast." Zira began working on the console, her glowing fingers deftly navigating the alien controls. Ethan stood nearby, keeping an eye on their surroundings. Every creak of the ship made him flinch, the memory of the beast still fresh in his mind. As Zira worked, she glanced at Ethan. "You could leave, you know," she said softly. "Return to your outpost. You do not have to stay." Ethan snorted. "Leave you here alone? Not a chance. Besides, I've come this far. Might as well see it through." Zira's glow brightened slightly, a faint smile crossing her lips. "You are strange for a human. I'll take that as a compliment," Ethan said, smirking. The console beeped, drawing their attention. Zira's expression lit up. "The beacon is active," she said. "Now, we wait." Ethan nodded, his hand resting on his rifle. "Let's hope your people get here before anything else does." The hours passed slowly, the icy wind outside serving as a constant reminder of the harsh world they were stranded on. Inside the damaged ship, Ethan sat by the console, his rifle within arm's reach. Zira was leaning against the wall, her glow faint but steady. The distress beacon pulsed softly, its rhythmic hum the only sound breaking the silence. "How long do you think it'll take?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Zira opened her violet eyes, her expression thoughtful. "If my people receive the signal, perhaps half a day. But I cannot promise." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't used to waiting. Action was his comfort zone, not sitting in a wrecked ship with an alien woman and a rifle, hoping help would come before the frost beast returned. "You trust your people to come for you?" he asked, glancing at her. Zira hesitated, her glowing skin dimming slightly. My people value knowledge above all else. If they know I carry important data, they will come. But she trailed off, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. But what? Ethan pressed. Zira looked at him, her voice soft. They may see you as a threat. Ethan blinked, leaning back. A threat? After all this, I saved your life. I know, Zira said quickly. But my people, they are cautious, suspicious of outsiders. Ethan chuckled bitterly. Great, so I help you survive, and my reward is getting treated like the enemy. Perfect. Zira's glow brightened slightly, and she placed a hand on his arm. I will explain. They will listen to me. You have proven yourself different, kind. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. I'll hold you to that. Suddenly, the console emitted a sharp beep. Zira straightened, her glowing eyes widening. A ship, she said, her voice tinged with hope. They'd received my signal. Ethan stood, grabbing his rifle. Let's hope it's your people and not someone else. Moments later, a faint rumble echoed through the air. Ethan peered through a cracked viewport and spotted a sleek, silver vessel descending through the swirling snow. It landed a short distance from the wreck, its lights cutting through the storm. Zira's glow brightened as she stood. It is them, my people. Ethan exhaled in relief but kept his rifle ready. All right, let's go. They stepped out of the ship, the cold wind biting at their skin. A group of figures emerged from the vessel, their silver armor gleaming in the moonlight. They moved with precision, their glowing eyes fixed on Zira. One of them stepped forward, speaking in a language Ethan couldn't understand. Zira responded, her voice firm but calm. She gestured toward Ethan, and the group hesitated before lowering their weapons. They understand, Zira said, turning to Ethan. You are safe. Ethan nodded, his grip on the rifle loosening. As Zira was escorted onto the ship, she looked back at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Ethan Kane, she said softly, for everything. Ethan smirked, giving her a small salute. Take care, Zira. As the ship lifted off, Ethan watched it disappear into the stormy sky. Alone again, he turned back toward the endless desert. A soldier's duty never ended.